I know, but you should. But you should.
I teach corporate finance.
Yeah, but you should teach this also.
ये 116 दिखा है.
So basically we teach CAPM and these theories. They are altogether different literature.
No, I think if you do the taxation side, I think it's more interesting. Taxation, cost of capital.
He teaches how to save the tax. How to
Sorry. Is it hello? Hello? Is it is it working? Tax evasion, tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is legal.
60 different types of tariff that you had shown.
Yeah.
Evasion is injurious.
Oh, okay. We have to move on. You're not going to get any more breaks, that's for sure. And we may have to, end a little bit later than normal. So this is a chapter from last year's survey, which I think is, my fear is that if this MOOC is done 10 years from now, my fear is that this topic will continue to be relevant. My hope is that I will be completely wrong and that India will not face the problem. What we called last year the Chakravyuha challenge. As you know that I only believe in Mahabharata metaphors for teaching in India. No Greek and Roman and other kinds of metaphors. And here, of course, it's a perfect metaphor because it's about how you can get in, but you can't get out. And we know what happened to Abhimanyu, and maybe the Indian economy is Abhimanyu. That's the central thesis here. So one of my one-liners that I hope will become immortal, and unless this man steals it as his own, is that if you wanted to ask me one sentence to capture what's happened to the Indian economy over time, I would say that we've gone from socialism with limited or no entry to capitalism with limited or no exit. That is my one-liner to summarize the Indian economy. I'm going to elaborate on that in the next 15-20 minutes. So when the famous phrase license, quota, permit, Raj was invented to describe the Indian development strategy, all kinds of controls. By the way, do people know who invented this term license, quota, permit, Raj? No, you're not allowed to speak. K. N. Raj, no, you'll get, I know you know the answer, so I'll give it to you. He will tell you the answer. Anyone else? Who created the term license, quota, permit, Raj? One of, I would say, India's finest political thinkers and probably the only true economic liberal in a conceptual sense that India has produced. Yes, and the answer is right. Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, C. Rajaji as he was affectionately known, he coined the term license, quota, permit, Raj. But when he coined the term, it was basically saying that you have all these controls and people can't enter. You can't enter into a new, produce a new commodity. Foreign goods can't come in. Foreign FDI can't come in. New entrants can't come in within a market. You have to get permission even to expand because of licensing. So that architecture, which had overwhelming panoply of controls on economic activity, on consumers, on producers, you name it, intermediaries, that was called. But essentially, he was talking mostly about entry. It turns out that we now have so many de facto and de jure restrictions on exit. And this is a joke. I like your paintings, but I'm more interested there, exit. So we know that a market economy requires, free entry of new firms, technologies, ideas, and so that they are guided to the most productive use. But Joseph Schumpeter, one of the great economists, also said, he coined the phrase, the gale of creative destruction. Essentially, a healthy economy is one where you not only have firms coming to life, new products, new ideas, but also you see a lot of death. You see, firms have to die, ideas have to die, technologies have to die, and it's that churn that produces economies. So if you say, I get a job, or I create a company, I create a trade, that has to be there forever, that's not how an economy can efficiently function. So this problem, and that's because, if you continue in unproductive activities, you're locking up a lot of valuable resources and the economy is less efficient. You need resources to flow from less efficient, less productive sectors to more. And so if you had a bullock cart, then the car came in, but you said, no, I must still be allowed to do the bullock cart. I will not allow the car to come in. Society will be much the worse off for that. So that's the sense in which you need exit. In India, what we discovered when we did this, that this is a problem that's endemic. Not being able to get out of inefficient activity is endemic. It's not just in the public sector, it's also in the private sector. It's not just in manufacturing, it's also in agriculture and services. Across the board, we are not able to get out of inefficient activity. It could be civil aviation. I won't name names, but you all know what I'm talking about. Agriculture, we spoke about, for example, how we love some sectors and some things too much. We can't get out of that. Welfare schemes, 950 schemes. I'm going to show you a chart. Public sector banks, companies, infrastructure, discoms, small savings, you name it. There's a lot of persistent, inefficient activity, and it's been persisting for a very, very long time, and this cannot be the sign of a good economy. So there are these two economists who've probably done the most sophisticated work analyzing Indian industry, Indian manufacturing, Changta Shea and Pete Klenow, and they show a couple of very interesting things. That so there's one data that I would like to see, which I haven't been able to get hold of, is, if you take the United States, for example, you can find out how many firms die every year. And I don't know what number, but I would love to see similar data on India, how many firms actually die, but we don't know. But what you do know is something like this. On the left-hand side, you see what is the average size in terms of employment of older firms relative to newer firms. So on this chart, you see relative employment in each country, and the argument is that small firms become big over time, and the process of becoming big is actually efficient. You're efficient, and then you grow big, and that's what happens in an economy. But what you find in India is that the average 40-year plant is only 1.5 times larger than a new one, whereas in the United States, it's about 8 times, and even in Mexico, it's about 2.5 times. So essentially, we have even the long-standing plants are still relatively small plants compared to those in other countries, which shows that plants are not becoming big, they're not dynamic, they're not efficient, and they just stay and stay and stay and hang around. And so there's other work showing that there are lots of inefficient plants in India compared to other countries. And the chart on the right basically reproduces the chart on the left, but over time, that not only in a cross-country comparison you find that good firms don't grow large enough and bad ones stick around for too long, that is actually changing for the worse over time. So the blue line is the 99 ASI, and the red line is the 2009-10, and that comes down. Yeah.
Is it any difference between public and private firms there?
So this is in the ASI, and you should. I don't know. I don't see whether I don't know whether they've done the distinction, but it would certainly be worth looking at. So the question was, is it the same for public and private sector firms? And we don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
We have this system, like a pyramid kind of system, where Indian firms are legally independent but belong to the same business houses. So they are not growing within the firm. They are like a conglomerate kind of thing. They would be growing, but outside that system, belong to the same business house. So, but that is not the case in Western or US or other countries.
See, remember, this is establishment plant-based data. So this is based on plants, not on companies. So we don't know anything about forms of financial organization, but this is about, if you have a plant, and if you have an efficient plant, that plant should expand over time and employ more people. And that's what this is trying to capture. So actually, let me move on, because you can come back to this later. And what are the costs of lack of exit? Now, well, I'll come to that in a second. What are the costs of lack of exit? Fiscal costs. Government has to keep supporting inefficient firms, either explicitly or implicitly. And we've been through all the subsidies that we give. We also give implicit subsidies in the form of loans, recapitalizing the banks. And what these people show is that if you corrected this misallocation of resources, Indian industry could be twice as productive as it is. And of course, there are lots of political costs that, well, there are costs both with preventing exit and costs with, making exit happen. So we're really stuck in a kind of vicious and unproductive cycle, as it were. Now, in the survey, you should go and read it. There are many, many examples of, the persistence of inefficient firms and industries. I mean, I'm not going to take you through all the examples. It's completely endemic. Air India, cumulative losses rising. Agriculture, we can't exit from cereals, and all the subsidies we spoke about. This is very interesting. So even if you take government programs, you can see how long they last. So for example, I think if you look at the 50% mark, 50% of firms are about 25 years old. There's one firm, Animal Husbandry and Livestock, which is 97 years old. I'm sure the people who created it could easily see 100 years into the future. They could anticipate what the needs would be in 1900. The Indian livestock industry, people doing that could easily see what would happen in 2000. The requirements were the same, but that scheme persists. And so this is an example of persistent, Vision. This is the vision that, and so you don't even have to go to the extreme example. I mean, you have, schemes persisting over time. Another example of lack of exit. Public sector banks, we know that, if you look at the return on assets of the average public sector bank, it's about 0.4. The international norm is that it should be about 1 or 1.5. I think very few public sector banks have in India consistently achieved that. And of course, they periodically get capital infusions from the government, high non-performing assets. We spoke about the power situation yesterday. This is the twin balance sheet problem. How many companies have debt more than, and they can't even generate enough cash? That's about 40%. But these companies have persisted for at least for now for almost 10 years, and that's another one. And then there are many, many examples. I think I haven't given you the example of small savings schemes. You have a similar problem. The fertilizer subsidy, firms, we spoke about the fertilizer plants, the kind of efficiency levels or lack thereof they have. And so this is a problem that's endemic. So I think that I would say that this is a major, major challenge for the Indian economy. We can get in, but like Abhimanyu, the Indian economy can't come out. And I think unless we crack this problem, we see that now in the twin balance sheet problem, and you see it everywhere. Unless we can get out, I think we will be tied to low levels of efficiency in the Indian economy. Now the question is, why doesn't this happen? I would say, I would call it the 3 I's: interests, ideology, and institutions. I think there are 3 I's that prevent exit in India. One, of course, is the standard thing is that once you get something, it's very difficult to get out of because there are interests around that, and it's going to be very difficult. And normally, remember, those who acquire these benefits are very concentrated. So, in a sense, the costs of this, of a lack of exit, are either paid by consumers in the form of higher prices, less efficiency, or they're paid by the government in the form of fiscal costs. So if you think about the political economy, you have very concentrated guys who have a lot at stake, and the beneficiaries are much more diffuse. Consumers, government, whatever that is. So it's a kind of unequal political economy battle, and that's why these things keep persisting. So concentrated interests always have an incentive and the ability to mobilize in a way that diffuse government or consumer interests do not have. So, but this is a kind of a standard explanation. I think the interesting thing about India is that you're also getting lack of exit because of institutions. But the funny thing is that there are weak institutions that create this lack of exit, and there are some very strong institutions that also create this lack of exit. The weak institutions, we know, for example, we saw data on the high courts, debt recovery tribunals. You can see, you have many examples where whatever needs to happen doesn't happen, justice is denied, recovery tribunals are stuck in litigation, they're not staffed enough, and so you don't get exit. And this is an example of debt recovery tribunals, which is meant to facilitate exit between people who have loans and people who between the creditor and the debtor. But these things are stuck for a very long time and doesn't happen. But we also have very strong institutions. Now, we know that we need strong referee institutions in every society, but we've got into a situation where these institutions perhaps have become so strong that it's creating paralysis in decision making and inducing abundant caution in decision making. In the case, for example, of the twin balance sheet problem that we have, essentially we know that very few public sector bank employees, regardless of levels, will have the courage to say, I am going to write down loans to the private sector, because if they do, they will immediately be open to allegation that they're favoring someone. In fact, if you look at the Prevention of Corruption Act in India for public servants, it doesn't say a kind of corrupt activity is an honest mistake, or a deliberate mistake. Even an honest mistake is considered corruption, because as long as a decision is seen to favor someone, it's corruption. And by definition, we know that any decision that we take will favor someone. And so the Prevention of Corruption Act also, that's why in the survey, we had a chapter last year or the year before saying we need to amend the Prevention of Corruption Act. But I think, as a government servant, civil servant, I'm not as a government employee, there are limits to how much we can discuss these things here. But there's no question that these strong institutions more and more seem to be creating an atmosphere of introducing kind of paralysis and caution in decision making. That's not to say, obviously they perform some absolutely critical functions and they do a stellar job in what they do, but there's also now increasingly these collateral aspects or dimensions to the working of these institutions. Now, ideology. I think that, and I'm going to get into trouble here, but now I don't, it's the last day, I'm going to run away from all of you. But I think that there is part of the problem also in India is the sanctification of the small. By definition, remember the chart that I showed you from Chang Tashi and Klino, around the world it is clear that job creation, exports, dynamism comes from small firms becoming big. You have to become big. So if we say we will favor the small and in the process keep them small, we will not get the efficiency gains that we need. So while all of us have to love khadi, handloom, small scale, etc., etc. But we have to recognize that these things have to become dynamic. Becoming dynamic means they have to grow, and if they can't do that, they will basically we have to find other ways of sustaining them, because they're not going to be agents of change in the economy. So, but there is this ideology across the spectrum that somehow small is great and beautiful, but I think small is great and beautiful to begin with, but remaining small forever can have costs as well, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. I think the other ideological problem we have is, of course, this is related to something I'm going to come to at the end. I think this perception that anything we can do can favor the private sector, and if in turn the private sector, we are ambivalent about the private sector, I think this is going to be a problem. Now, what are the solutions to this? I think there are solutions. I think for a long time, if you think about what we did in aviation and telecom, we didn't do exit. What we did was we allowed more and more liberal entry. So we had inefficient public sector enterprises. We didn't do anything with them, but we said we'll allow the private sector to come in. So we avoided exit for a long time through liberal entry and aviation, and in some cases at least, aviation for some time at least, bringing in the private sector actually seemed to have also a positive impact on the public sector incumbent, but that clearly hasn't persisted. So I think that's one way we've chosen of at least not facilitating exit, but at least in minimizing the kind of most egregious consequences of not having exit. The other thing, of course, we can take direct policy action. Now that's what we're doing with the NPAs. We have a new bankruptcy law, and as you speak today, you must have read the newspapers. The RBI has put 12 firms, or identified a list of 12 firms that will go into bankruptcy, and maybe this is some way where we can maybe facilitate faster exit. Technology and JAM, I think Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, again, offer a way out of some of this. For example, wherever you have social welfare schemes that are working or leaking, we can bring in JAM to at least get rid of duplication, ghost beneficiaries, and all of that. And I think that's something we can do. I think we can also bring in transparency. We spoke about how can we advertise the costs of many of these programs. The fertilizer subsidy, maybe we should do more social cost benefit analysis, like we said in agriculture. I think can we do transparency more? And the last thing I think is that often, I think to some extent we've been a little bit unimaginative in this. I think exit also can be an opportunity. Several people have good ideas about how to facilitate disinvestment. For example, public sector enterprises have a lot of land. Maybe this investment will be a way of getting land banks going. Getting this land, maybe using it, monetizing it, and doing clever, imaginative things with it. And so one can think of exit even as an opportunity, but I think we're far, far away from that. But basically that exit is like a shackle, lack of exit is like a shackle on the Indian economy, and it's a first order problem. So socialism with limited entry was bad. Capitalism without exit, I don't know whether it's as bad, but it does impose a lot of costs on the Indian economy. Now, I'm going to go to the last chapter, and in some ways going to tie it up with the first chapter that we did about, question.
So when we came with the open sky policy in Indian aviation sector, the expectation was that the public sector unit is going to perform better. Mm-hmm. And then there was a merger of Indian Airlines and Air India. And of course, Air India was in losses, Indian Airlines was doing well. But afterwards, what happened, they continued with the losses, and the problem always came from the Air India side. Now when we are thinking to privatize this, the employees are saying, which is correct also, that the decisions which were taken by the minister at that time they are responsible for the losses that we are making here. So in a way, it's the wrong policy and the implementation from the government side. So now the government cannot say and come and say that, okay, we are going to privatize you. So, and there are FIRs also lodged on this, and CBI is investigating. So what are your takes on it as a policy maker? How do we handle this situation? Because this doesn't seem to be a pure economic problem.
Okay, if you don't mind, I haven't studied this closely, the Air India problem closely. I think that there are, the point that you make is a legitimate one, but this is kind of normal to all democracies where you have, transitions of power, right? I mean, previous governments will make some decisions, other governments will inherit some of them, and you just have to find ways. If you think this is a good thing to do, you'll just have to find ways of doing it. There will be political challenges. I think those are things that they will have to, part of, who said that, exit is profoundly a political challenge. That's why in some ways we're stuck in this, right? We know, because we know the economic costs. It's just that we haven't found political ways out of it, and in this particular case they have to find their own political ways out of it. So, but I don't know what those ways specifically are. Yeah.
So when we talk about khadi or handloom, so isn't it more of an employment issue and an very important economic issue rather than an ideological issue?
No, the thing is that we know that if they are not efficient, they can only survive on subsidies, or they start small and they have to become big. So if they remain small and remain inefficient, then what you're basically saying is that we need to provide massive subsidies for employment, and that's what it ends up being. On the other hand, if the small became dynamic and efficient and big, then they would increase their employment. And then that would also then serve the employment objective that we started out with in the first place. Can I just move?
So as you just mentioned that small needs to grow and improve on the ideas and innovation, but don't you think our policy are designed that way is that you have an incentive to remain small, be it in our fertilizer industry or DESCOM?
See, I've spoken about the our development policy, how it favored remaining small. We spoke about that, small-scale reservations, tax incentives, labor laws. By the way, I didn't mention one of the best examples of lack of exit, many would say, is labor laws. I forgot to mention that, where it's very difficult to attract people and unattract people or employees over time. It gets very difficult to do. So we do have this panoply, and the problem is that even though we change our laws, or we're making great progress in changing our laws, I think that as you were also hinting, it's easy to change the law, but it's very difficult to actually implement these things because of all these ideas, interests, and institutions that we have. I think those finally have come in the way. Last question, because you haven't asked one before, and then I have to move on. Yeah.
So you showed a couple of charts regarding the farms not growing large over time. So are these all the firms? Do we control for some size? Do they include small and medium enterprises? So
yeah, see, these are all data from the ASI. So by definition, they are firms, greater than factory. 10 people or 100 people? All registered, but registered, you have to register beyond 10, beyond 10, exactly. So it's beyond 10, yeah. Yeah, if you're more than 10, they include SMEs as well.
And then the priority sector lending thing comes into play.
No, priority sector lending is, here we're just measuring what the consequences, whether they're getting priority sector lending, not. All these are, those are happening, but the final impact in terms of size and employment is what I showed you.
So there is research, like we came across a few months back, that because of the priority sector lending, small and medium enterprises are being kept small and medium because the banks have incentives to do so. And
see, I think that chart that we showed, that movie clip that we showed, where you want to permanently be poor, is kind of an example of the same. It's a metaphor for the same thing, I think. Yeah. Okay. So, what are the meta challenges? I want to spell out what I think are 3 or 4 big meta challenges that I think face the Indian economy. So, so meta means, you know, transcending, big. You could either say it's meta challenges or profound, you know, Akash, Patal, you know, you choose your metaphor, something very big, either very big or very deep, meta challenges. And I want to emphasize that this is not a comment about what's happening today, but these are precisely meta challenges because they have persisted for a long time and they transcend, you know, it's not that one party, I'm not just accusing my friend here from one party, I think it's common to all parties, it's across the ideological spectrum, and that's what I want to focus on. See, like the deeper problems, challenges that the Indian economy faces. So, at one level, if you think about Indian history, you can say, you know, 35 years of socialism, and then 35 years of the Washington Consensus. You know what the Washington Consensus is? You know, liberalize, privatize, deregulate, etc., etc. So in some senses, you know, a crude caricature of Indian history would be 35 years of socialism, and then we repudiate socialism, and now we're on the Washington Consensus. And in pure Washington Consensus terms, actually we have delivered. You know, the economy is more open, and I showed you the Jana Gana Mana moment, trade to GDP, China, India greater than China. So India is a highly open economy. We're also highly open to foreign capital. Now a lot of FDI comes in, a lot of portfolio inflows come in, and we look very respectable in the middle of the pack on all these things compared to other emerging market economies. We don't have a very big government. You know, people's, you know, socialism is associated with a lot of spending and therefore big government. We don't have very big government. And actually it turns out, even if you look at our public sector enterprises as a share, take any share of GNP or whatever, they're not that big compared to comparable emerging markets. Again, we're either in the middle, but we're not really, you can't say that the Indian public sector enterprises account for a much bigger share of the economy than public sector enterprises in other countries. Yeah, question?
What period?
I mean, this is for latest data that we had. Huh? Latest data, about 2013, 14, 15, something like that.
Indian firms are actually doing better than Chinese because the rate of profit out of sales is higher for them, because 4% out of 15%. In case of China, it's 3% out of 24%.
Yeah. So in that sense, you know, but either way, I think you can't really say that there's too much public sector in India compared to these other countries. So if you take, I'm just giving you 4 standard indicators of how, you know, you would assess how open or how liberal an economy is. And on these 4 sectors, the Indian economy doesn't do too badly. And this is what I think is very interesting, that, you know, and this is a chart that shows how many years of democracy a country has had in the boom period, when it has grown rapidly, and what has been the annual per capita GDP growth. And what you find is actually India, for a democracy, it's actually posted remarkable economic growth for a democracy. You know, most the countries that have grown faster than India have either been autocracies during the period, or they have recovered from World War II, which is what happened to, you know, Spain, Portugal, to some extent Greece after World War II, or they've been oil economies. So either autocracies in East Asia, oil economies, or countries recovering from war. So if you focus on rapid growth episodes and you focus on, you know, how India has done, the fact that it's been a democracy and an uninterrupted democracy, I mean, it's one of the remarkable performers. So at one level, you know, the question, you know, what am I talking about meta challenges? The Indian economy, of course, there have been other problems that people have raised, you know, health and education. I'm just going to come to that in a second. But overall, mota, as they say, macroeconomic terms, growth, trade, FDI, all the things that you look at, India has not done too bad, not done badly at all. I think 4.5% per capita growth for 35 plus years, very few countries have done, but certainly virtually no democracy, no uninterrupted democracy has done this. But I would argue that despite all this, there are 3 meta challenges that India faces, and I'm going to give you examples of that, and say why I think they are pretty major and big problems. The first thing I would say is that we still have a deep ambivalence about the private sector. And if I were to take a poll in this room and ask you private sector good or bad, I am confident that a majority of you would say private sector not so good. I am confident of that. And I look at my friend and he's looking at me and we're exchanging glances and he knows who I'm referring to.
Hello, sir.
No, no.
One small question, sir.
No, let me finish. Let me give the evidence.
That's one small question, sir. You have to answer.
Yeah.
Sir, why do you people, including the government of India, which has ruled for the last 70 years, sometimes it appears that you all people see the private sector as panacea for all diseases. This is one question. Another one is, I shall like to have a few words from your mouth.
Now it's getting
yes.
exciting now.
Yes. I shall like to have a few words of conclusion from your mouth. What are the causes of fluctuating fortunes of Indian economic development during the last 70 years?
Yeah, that's what I'm coming to. I'm coming to. Some things I'll give you on camera, some things I'll give you off camera. Okay? But anyway, but they will all be from my mouth. They will all be from my mouth, not from someone else's mouth. They'll all be from my mouth. So here's an example of. So they do these world value surveys, and they go around countries and asking all kinds of questions. But this is a survey on attitude to private sector, and they ask exactly this question. Do you think there should be more private sector? Do you think there should be less? My friend, again, I'm presenting evidence. I'm going to give you my views later, but here I'm just presenting evidence. So facts, not opinions. So here it turns out that in the world value surveys, it turns out that India, attitudes to the private sector are less favorable in India than they are in many other countries. Now, what are my examples of our ambivalence about the private sector and protecting property rights? For example, we still have retrospective actions. You know, I've been through all the exit problems, for example. We're still finding it difficult to do the twin balance sheet problem because we are, ambivalent about being seen as favoring the private sector. In the public sector, fertilizer sector, we are finding it easier to rehabilitate highly inefficient plants rather than facilitating the exit of highly inefficient plants. So we're actually rehabilitating, again, strategic disinvestments we're unable to do. In agriculture, we still have a fair amount of restrictions. There are export restrictions on farmers not being able to sell. So in a sense, and also something that I didn't realize until very recently, that in our constitution, until about 1977, property rights were recognized as a fundamental right. After 77, they became another right, but not a fundamental right. So again, remember, I'm just presenting facts. I'm just saying that this is how, what our attitude is towards the private sector. And these are, the list could expand, but essentially that, and I'm not even saying, it's not even that, why don't we get more public sector, more private sector, but we are hesitant about, even going a little step further. Again, not good or bad, not right or wrong. Off camera, I'll tell you my real views. So the second thing I think is something that now all of you will also, I think, maybe sympathize with this much more. I think fundamentally one of India's biggest challenges is the inability of the state to deliver essential services like health and education and maybe even public investment. I used to write articles for a long time about comparing India and China. I would say that, the Indian private sector is as good as anything in the world, but it's in the Indian state relative to, say, the Chinese state or the state in other countries that's not been able to, and this came up last time. Lant Pritchett is a Harvard economist who describes the Indian state as a flailing state that is kind of unable to do a lot of things. But of course, there have been a lot of exceptions. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush uniformly. You know, there have been improvements in the PDS that other people have noted, power delivery in Gujarat, procurement, wheat procurement in Madhya Pradesh. We've had environmental changes recently in Haryana. So we've had, and of course Tamil Nadu and Kerala have had a history of delivering reasonable health and education. So I think that's the case. But the truth is that health and education outcomes remain. We saw yesterday that learning outcomes are very, very poor and declining in India. And here, so this is one big point I want you to take away with, and I'm going to spend some time on this. When we talk about these health and services, the question that I'm always asked is, oh, but why hasn't the state done more? Why hasn't the government done more? Why hasn't the state done more? Why didn't Nehru do more? Why didn't Indira Gandhi do more, etc., etc.? Or why didn't Jyoti Basu do more? You know, you can name your chief minister and prime minister. You can ask that question. But I think the fundamental paradox on this of India is the following, and the mystery and the thing. It is not why the state hasn't delivered better outcomes. It is why the democratic process has not put enough pressure on governments to deliver better outcomes. That's the question. Because remember here the thing is this, that if there are a lot of uneducated children, if there are a lot of people with poor access to services, in a democracy, these people count for a lot. You know, one person, one vote. Why hasn't our democracy then delivered this? One of my recent examples that made this come home to me is that before the UP election last year, I would see, and I'm sure this was true in the Hindi language papers as well, full page ads taken out by the previous chief minister. Basically, vote for me, I built the highway from Lucknow to Agra, right? You saw full page ads in every newspaper. I know nothing about politics, I know nothing about BJP, SP, whatever. But the question as an academic I asked myself was this: why is it that he thought he could win an election saying, I built a road that probably benefits I don't know how many people? Why haven't politicians in India said over time, I can actually win votes, I can have front page ads saying, I have educated 25 million people in my state, vote for me. I have provided better medical services to 30 million people, why don't you vote for me? Why hasn't there been political opportunity and advantage in delivering essential services? Now, for example, and here's the puzzle, of course, right? And this is where we come to competitive federalism in India. It has been true in the last 10, 15, 20 years that when it comes to attracting investment, for example, or getting firms and business to come to your state, there has been a very powerful and positive dynamic at work. So, for example, when the nano plant was going to be built in West Bengal, we know all that happened, and in the old India, what would have happened is that nano plant project would have died, but in the new India, 5 other states came up and said, if you don't finance it, we will finance it. That was competitive federalism, and therefore, once one state does it, other states recognize that if you want to attract capital and labor, we also have to do the right things. For example, power, if Tamil Nadu probably lost a lot of investments because the power situation was not very good. But at least when it comes to these other economic outcomes, there is this dynamic process of competitive federalism. But in the case of health and education, remember, these are things that not just, or not at all, that central governments need to do. In principle, you could have just 1 or 2 state governments over the last 70 years saying, vote for me, I did so much on health and education. But we've seen very few examples in Indian history, Indian economic history, where actually delivering essential services like health and education have been a political opportunity and a political vote winner. I think that is the fundamental paradox of state capacity. So in response to my friends who think, I'm in the pocket of all the multinationals put together, I want to say that I strongly believe that, the difference between a country that grows rapidly and the country that doesn't, that achieves development, is a country that actually has an effective state that can deliver these essential services. But in a democracy, it's not just a top-down, why don't they deliver, but why isn't there pressure to deliver? I can give you my favorite example of how this pressure from below works. Given that we have the time, I'm going to speak. It's my turn. It's from my mouth and my turn to speak. I'm going to speak. So one of the things I've always thought about is, you live abroad, people say, oh, IIT, IIM are the great, Indian institutions, etc., etc., and that's true, of course, there's no question. But to me, what has been the success of Indian education has actually been secondary school education in urban India. And why has that happened? It's happened because the urban middle class in India have had the force, the political ability to force the government to produce either better schools in the form of the Kendriya Vidyalayas, etc., or to regulate it better so that private schooling has also flourished to a great extent. The power of the middle class in India over the last 40 years in getting, I'm not saying urban primary education, rural primary education, but urban secondary education, of which almost all of us are products, is because of this pressure from below. That has not happened to the same extent or at all in these important health and education outcomes. I know there are going to be a lot of questions at the end. So that's the third point I feel is that all societies need to redistribute, no question, but do we do it more inefficiently than we should or than other countries do? I showed you when we did the UBI, I showed you those two charts about how much duplication, waste and leakage takes place. I think to some extent it is true that we don't redistribute very efficiently, and that's a fundamental challenge for India. Now, what are the explanations? Okay, now I'm going to come to explanations. Now, small detour into history and connecting it back with the first lecture. If you look at successful models of economic development, there have been two models in history of successful development. The one, North America, Western Europe, they developed slowly over time, 150, 200 years, slow but steady progress and slow political development. They began with limited democracy, but over time, economic and political development happened after 150, 200 years. That's one model of successful development. The other model of successful development, after the war, East Asian countries rapidly grew, but under conditions of autocracy, no political freedom. So you've had two models: rapid growth under conditions of autocracy initially, which then over time you get more political freedoms. A successful model, but slow model over 150, 200 years, but where economic and political development go together. India is in that sense a very unusual model, which I showed you earlier. We tried to do political development first, and then we tried to do economic development. We haven't done too badly, but the point is it's very unusual, and the fact of being a democracy so early could in fact have given rise to some of these meta challenges that I'm speaking about. How? Let me give you two examples. So it is not, go back to 47. I think it's not at all unusual or unpredictable or unanticipatable that a poor democracy which is shaking off its colonial chains, it is completely understandable, and the way that our industry was treated by the United Kingdom, deindustrialization happened. It was not at all surprising that we had this inherent wariness of the private sector. And as I showed you, the Khrushchev clip, all countries were doing socialism, so we did socialism as well. And so it's not at all unusual that we began with a distrust of the private sector. Over time, of course, I think that got reinforced. So now I'm giving you reasons. I'm explaining to you why we have this, and it's a kind of explanation, which is that our private sector has always been, to some extent, tainted because with this mixed economy business, they always grew, and the ones that grew and flourished, always the kind of overhang that they flourish under conditions of controls, etc. It's because they have preferential access to all of this. So in that sense, if these were beneficiaries, they grew under a license per metrage, it's because they grew because of the license per metrage, and therefore it's a tainted private sector and not an untainted private sector. That is why if you think that the Indian IT sector is the one that's relatively free of this kind of taint or stigma, because everyone thinks that this is a sector, became competitive internationally, was unregulated, no special sweetheart deals, no protection, no licensing, etc., etc. So we have this. So so in that sense, sir, I'm saying it's understandable that we have this ambivalence. And I'm supporting you. I'm not supporting you in saying we should do this. I can completely understand why we are where we are, this inherent distrust or ambivalence about the private sector. Now, second, when it comes to inefficient redistribution, I think that we have to realize that if you start off poor and if you are a democracy, there will be many more pressures to redistribute. That's unavoidable, necessary. We're a poor country, we have to redistribute. Also remember that because you have to do this under circumstances where you're poor and you have weak capacity, you will always have inefficient redistribution. Again, therefore, inefficient redistribution is completely understandable. It's not that early on we could say we don't care about the poor, we will just favor the private sector, we don't care about what's happening. We had to redistribute, and rightly so, but poor democracies with poor, weak state capacity are by definition not able to spend well, spend effectively, and that's why we have this inefficient redistribution. The question then becomes, yes, okay, what I've said explains why inefficient redistribution began. Next question, why does it have to persist? Why can't, after some point in time, you move away from inefficient to efficient redistribution? And there, I think one tentative answer is, exit is so difficult. You have all these programs, you cannot get rid of them, you can only keep adding more programs. So if exit is difficult, then you begin with inefficiency because of historical understandable reasons. You continue with it because we can't get out of it. Of course, to some extent, we are trying to get out of it through technology, DBT, and JAM, but it's going to be a slow process. Now, so this is a chart that shows, the premature pressures to spend, the income level at which countries spent 27% of GDP. Most countries have to spend this very late in the development process, but India, being a democracy, it's had to spend this at much lower levels of per capita GDP than other countries. Therefore, if you have to do the same amount of spending at lower levels, you will be less able and less effective in doing that because you have weaker state capacity than these other things. Now, I'm going to come to, my Kerala friend asked me a beautiful question yesterday about this whole public services versus redistribution. Okay, now one of the consequences of all of this we've seen, for example, few voters to taxpayers. Now, why is that? And I tried to argue yesterday that it's partly because voluntary tax paying is also a voluntary activity, and you will only voluntarily agree to pay taxes is if you feel you're getting something out of government. Now, here there's a really, really important historical point, which is made by Professor Indira Rajaraman of NIPFP. I think it's a really brilliant and deeply insightful point, which will answer my friend's question. Historically, if you look at especially Western Europe and the United States, I told you that income tax came late in the process. Late. They didn't start doing income tax very early. Came very late in the process. And it came after these big world wars and Great Depression and so on. But what is interesting is this, that the state has two functions: provide services and public goods and redistribute. Both are important functions. Historically, most governments that have developed have done redistribution quite late in the process. They haven't, if you look at US government, most of it in taxes were used to finance public infrastructure. And redistribution came very late in the process. So in a sense, the legitimacy to redistribute comes if the state has acquired legitimacy by saying, I have actually delivered public services. So the people who pay taxes say, look, I am willing for my money to go to someone else if I know that I'm actually getting something from government. If I feel that the only thing I'm getting from government is my money is being used to finance someone else, then I will not pay taxes. Now, the problem in India is that because we were an early democracy, because we were poor very early, the pressures to redistribute began quite early. So in some ways, the government has had to redistribute without a legitimizing track record of being able to deliver services efficiently and effectively. So it is not unnatural to see, lots of people saying, look, what do I get out of this government? And therefore, I will not pay taxes. Now, again, this is not a justification. It is an explanation for why India is special. We've had to do, most countries, if you're an autocracy, you don't have to redistribute as much. Remember the cruel choice: you can do a lot of investment and you can forget about consumption. You can do a lot of investment, you can forget about redistribution. Advanced economies, they actually, they didn't give voting rights to people. They only gave voting rights over time as the economy developed and as they could do the taxation and building. India, that's why it's very special. You start early on as a democracy, as a poor democracy. You have to redistribute. You're not able to provide the essential services, and so you get the phenomenon of what Albert Hirschman called exit. That is, people check out of the system. The middle class gets its own security, gets its own schools, gets its own water, and we get into a kind of unstable equilibrium. So in some ways, this is, I think, a deep, deep paradox and dilemma, but something that relates to the way our economic and social development have evolved, in some sense, the kind of implicit tax of having started out as a precocious, poor, cleavaged democracy. I've shown you this. This is going to be my last slide. So, as I said, these are challenges that are shared across the social spectrum. It's not one party, one thing. And I do think that if you want to assess them, for example, how do we get governments and political parties saying, I want to win votes based on my track record on health and education? I don't know how that's going to happen, but that's a fundamental shift that has to happen. And therefore, I feel that, many of these fundamental shifts requires fundamental shifts in our shared ideas in society about many of these things. John Maynard Keynes said, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. I want to sort of end by saying, I want to introduce my team that did this, but before I do so, I want to end by saying, look, to all of you watching, to all of you here, economists have a very important role to perform. They have this very important role to perform at the level of ideas, at the level of analysis. I do hope that one of you, one of your students, one of those watching will be the future chief economic advisor to the government of India, because economics is important, it is fun, it is something that we have a responsibility, all of you and us, to make it fun, to make it accessible, to demystify it, to expose them to new ways of thinking, to expose them to data, and that is kind of the bigger enterprise that this module represents. And having all of you in this here and elsewhere, in this shared enterprise, that's what we want. We want to make engaged citizens. We want to make them economically, not just literate, but engaged in a very kind of creative and active way. I want to say that, first of all, I want all my team members to come here, please. All of them. Who? Oh, I see. Okay, I'll tell you what, let me introduce my team, and then let's have questions, because I've been remiss in this. Please, team, come. It's also because, all of you, if you have follow-up questions, I think these are the people to talk to. Rangeet Ghosh, clap him. Parth Khare, Zubair Naqvi, Abhishek Anand, Kapil Patidar, G. Gayatri, Navneeraj Sharma. So give them all a big round. Oh, and Professor Paul, of course. Oh, he's now an honorary member of Team CEA. Anthony Syriac is here. Please come, please come. Where's Ananya is not here, unfortunately. Anthony, please come. But there are many, many other people as well who've contributed to the survey. And I think all of them should get. I am not trying to get away from questions, but this is very important.
Sir, we need 5 minutes of your time, sir.
Okay. After questions?
No questions. We're replacing the questions. If you allow us to.
But that depends. I'm in your hands. I'm in your hands.
So this is, if the audience allows us, the questions can come later. He's handled too many questions. I think his last. Oh dear. I'm so sorry. The last 15 minutes of what Dr. Arvind said were wonderful, beautiful, and I think we were all waiting for that for the last 7 days, sir.
Okay.
So all those offline, online, we can now go offline for this short 5 minutes, I think. We like to go offline, then we'll probably hear more offline comments from him also. We'll try and get some more comments from him. We would now like to